the exceptional Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. In addition to being a poet, she was a novelist, an essayist, a significant figure in the abolitionist movement, but she was also someone who advocated for women's rights. For today, the poetry that I asked you to read instead, I'll start with The Slave Mother. I won't have an opportunity to talk about all of these poems, but what I like about Harper is in the poetry that I asked you to read for today, she seems to collect a lot of the themes and ideas that we have discussed and explored over the last couple of weeks, and I'll certainly make reference to those when applicable. But it's important to know that unlike some of the other writers of color that we have read and discussed this semester, Harper, even though she writes about slavery, she was not born into slavery. She was born free in Maryland, even though Maryland at the time of her birth was under the occupation of slavery, or it maintained the legal status of slavery. She was never a slave at any point in her life. However, that doesn't preclude her from understanding the plight of the slave, and that doesn't preclude her from understanding the trouble, the problems, the anxiety, both physical, psychological, and emotional, of the racial dynamics in the United States in the 19th century. And many of the poems, with the exception perhaps of Learning to Read, many of these poems were written during the antebellum period. So they were written at a time that is, broadly speaking, contemporary with the Frederick Douglass autobiography, or the Frederick Douglass narrative, to be more accurate. Again, it is not surprising to see a lot of the ideas that Douglass, for example, grappled with present in the poetry of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. But some of the broad themes that I think are worth exploring, you'll notice she often references mothers and maternal figures, or perhaps just at large female figures. And I think this is one of the moments, and I'll talk about this in particular with Learning to Read, this is one of the moments where you can see her advocacy for abolition and her advocacy for equal rights blending or merging or sharing the same sort of space. I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that this abolitionist movement was not exclusive to, or it wasn't separate from the political concerns and the political preoccupation of other minority movements. In fact, there was a lot of space shared between abolitionists and those advocating for equal rights, women's rights. And I think we see that idea quite clearly in Learning to Read. But in addition to the prevalence of mothers and maternal figures, the idea of hearing, you might notice she often references overhearing or hearing something, hearing trauma, hearing something disruptive. And I'll talk more about this because I think this is another one of the more interesting aspects of her poetry, which in many ways, even though it's not in complete contrast to Douglass, it offers an additional dimension to some of the more horrifying visual images that Douglass narrativizes. And for someone like Watkins Harper, often it is what we hear or what the speakers in her poetry hear. And I think hearing is such an interesting way of thinking about the horrors and the trauma of slavery and the horrifying racial dynamics of the 19th century. But it's also worth saying that she's someone who, in several of her poems, seems to advocate for a kind of belligerence. This is another interesting theme, not being passive, which is something we saw in Douglass. Douglass, I'm paraphrasing here, but he in effect said, kill me before you would allow me to remain passive. And I think we see that often in several of Watkins Harper's poems. But again, I think the best place to start is with the slave mother, because even though, considering what I just said, this is one of the poems where we perhaps see how regrettably powerless certain figures are. And the tragedy here seems to be the mother, the slave mother, who also produces slaves, the lack of power that she has within that dynamic. So I'll read the poem and then I'll offer a bit of commentary. Heard you that shriek? It rose so wildly on the air, it seemed as if a burdened heart was breaking in despair. Saw you those hands so sadly clasped, the bowed and feeble head, the shuddering of that fragile form, that look of grief and dread? Saw you the sad, imploring eye? Its every glance was pain, as if a storm of agony were sweeping through the brain. She is a mother pale with fear. Her boy clings to her side, and in her kirtle vainly tries his trembling form to hide. He is not hers, although she bore for him a mother's pain. He is not hers, although her blood is coursing through his veins. He is not hers, for cruel hands may rudely tear apart the only wreath of household love that binds her breaking heart. His love has been a joyous light, that o'er her pathway smiled, a fountain gushing ever new amid life's desert wild. His lightest word has been a tone of music round her heart. Their lives a streamlet blent in one, O Father, must they part? They tear him from her circling arms, her last and fond embrace. Oh, never more may her sad eyes gaze on his mournful face. No marvel then these bitter shrieks disturb the listening ear. She is a mother and her heart is breaking in despair. So, again, notice how, and it's not like Watkins Harper doesn't offer visual imagery, at times, of course, quite profound visual imagery, but here at the beginning of this poem, we're asked to hear first. And again, we see this repeatedly throughout many of her poems, hearing as a way of understanding something, or what we hear as perhaps functioning in a more disruptive way than what we see. But notice how the poem begins not with a statement, but with a question. Heard you that shriek? Which might suggest a couple of interesting and important things. It might suggest that we as the listener, or we as the reader, didn't hear it. And I would encourage you to think about, well, what that might actually mean, that we were not privy to this sound that the speaker clearly heard. Is it because of our distance? Is it, and I think this is perhaps the more horrifying possibility, that this happens with such regularity that it's something that we and many others may not actually consider or recognize. Think about how if you transported someone from the 19th century and placed them here in the 21st century, the sorts of things they would hear that we don't hear any longer, because it's just part of the world we occupy, and it's part of the world that we traffic in. And I think some of it might be, for example, just the sounds of appliances and electricity. Again, the sorts of things that we don't actually consider or acknowledge because they're just a part of the world that we occupy. And maybe a similar sort of dynamic is happening here, that this shriek, which all of us should hear and should acknowledge, that no one should ever just not hear, is something that we potentially don't hear. And then at the end of this first stanza, it seemed as if a burdened heart was breaking in despair. And I think this is important as well, because this dynamic that Watkins Harper grapples with in this poem, a slave mother whose child is taken from her. This is a dynamic and this is a practice that happened with frightening regularity before the end of the American Civil War, before the end of slavery. But notice how it's still, each and every one of those moments, each and every one of those instances still has this effect. There's no way for the slave mother to ever be desensitized to this process. And I think this is important. And we see, and again, Watkins Harper offers a fair amount of detail throughout this poem that illustrates how this is not something that the slave mother has acclimated or adjusted to. And I think this is important because this idea that each and every time a child is taken, it produces despair, it produces trauma. This, in many ways, antagonizes perhaps what this system attempted to do: take people and turn them into something else entirely. I think the language, for example, that Douglas used was break. And I think it's important to notice that the slave mother, she hasn't broken. Maybe this is part of that breaking, that you as the slave mother to start to see and understand yourself as this vehicle or this vessel for producing quite literally capital in the form of human bodies. There's no breaking of that remains. And I think that speaks to, for a poet like Watkins Harper, the power and the reverence she has for the maternal figure, in particular the black slave maternal figure. Something else that's interesting, there's this contradiction, and I think you may notice that Watkins Harper grapples with contradiction in interesting ways. We get this sense near the end of stanza 4 and the beginning of stanza 5. He is not hers, although she bore for him a mother's pain. He is not hers, although her blood is coursing through his veins. He is not hers, for cruel hands may rudely tear apart the only wreath of household love that binds her breaking heart. You'll notice that Watkins Harper deploys repetition often and in interesting ways, and I would encourage you just to think of the effect of hearing, or the effect of repeating this clause, he is not hers. Because I think through this contradiction, because clearly the boy belongs to her in the same way that small children belong to their parents. But I think for a poet like Watkins Harper, the point she's ultimately making is there's something contradictory happening in this system where someone can produce a child, yet because the person who produced it is a slave, immediately what they produced doesn't actually belong to them. Again, they're not in the eyes of their slave owners and in the eyes of their masters, they're not producing people, they're producing capital in the form of people. And so that is an interesting contradiction that I would encourage you, if you're interested in writing about her, that's an interesting contradiction worth thinking about, how a small child in particular can both belong to and not belong to their mother. And near the end of the poem, we have this sense of, regrettably, what ultimately binds or connects these two, mother and child, during that moment when the child is taken from the mother. And this is what we hear. They tear him from her circling arms, her last and fond embrace. Oh, never more may her sad eyes gaze on his mournful face. And notice the language that's used to modify her eyes in his face. Sad, mournful. So the thing that both seals but also disrupts their bond is sadness, mournfulness, and trauma. And it's not that we needed to have someone communicate that to us, especially from our historical vantage point, but I think for someone like Watkins Harper, this is important, communicating this idea that and it's regrettably the thing that unites or bonds these two more than anything is perhaps despair, sadness, loss, mourning. So this is one of the few poems in the slate of poems that I asked you to read for today that doesn't celebrate the agency of either the slave or the agency of people of color. This is a poem that's attempting to understand how and to what degree their sense of authority and their sense of personal agency was perpetually stripped and taken from them, precluded from them. And I think this is a powerful articulation of that idea. So let's transition to the Tennessee Hero. This poem begins on 1634, and follow along with me. He had heard his comrades plotting to obtain their liberty, and rather than betray them, he received 750 lashes and died. He stood before the savage throng, the base and coward crew. A tameless light flashed from his eye, his heart beat firm and true. He was the hero of his band, the noblest of them all. Though fetters galled his weary limbs, his spirit spurned their thrall. And towered in its manly might above the murderous crew, oh, liberty had nerved his heart, and every pulse beat true. Now tell us, said the savage troop, and life thy gain shall be, who are the men that plotting say they must and will be free? Oh, could you have seen the hero then, as his lofty soul arose, and his dauntless eyes defiance flashed on his mean and craven foes. I know the men who would be free, they are the heroes of your land, but death and torture I defy ere I betray that band. And what? Oh, what is life to me beneath your base control? Nay, do your worst, you have no chains to bind my freeborn soul. They brought the hateful lash and scourge with murder in each eye, but a solemn vow was on his lips, he had resolved to die. Yes, rather than betray his trust, he'd meet a death of pain. 'Twas sweeter far to meet it thus than wear a treason stain. Like storms of wrath, of hate and pain, the blows rained thick and fast, but the monarch soul kept true till the gates of life were passed. And the martyr spirit fled to the throne of God on high, and showed his gaping wounds before the unslumbering eye. So this is a poem that's clearly about courage and defiance, in particular in the face of death, pain, and physical torment. But like we saw in several moments from the Frederick Douglass narrative from last week, it's also a poem that celebrates this desire to antagonize white slave owners, and it's a poem that celebrates this desire to be petulant. This is a poem that celebrates petulance in some way. It's a poem that celebrates the desire and the strength to agitate. And it's a poem that also speaks to this sense of unity among people of color, in particular slaves, that the worst thing you could do is to betray your brothers and betray your sisters, because that's seen in many ways as a betrayal of your race, a betrayal of this cause for freedom and equality. And notice what happens to this individual. Yes, of course, they die, and they die in a painful and awful way, but there is this exaltation at the end of the poem. There's this sense that through the horrifying death and through this individual's willingness to not disclose these individuals who were seeking their freedom, they've experienced this elevation of some kind. Again, read the final stanza, and the martyr spirit. Notice again, this person is cast and characterized as a martyr, which the martyr has a particular and elevated status within certain movements. And the martyr spirit fled to the throne of God on high and showed his gaping wounds before the unslumbering eye. And so notice this connection, and I think this is quite overt. It's not very subtle. It seems as if Watkins Harper is suggesting that this person is similar to and akin to Jesus in many ways. Think about this idea of Jesus retaining the scars of the physical abuse he suffered before his death, and this individual is elevated and celebrated in a similar sort of way. And I'll leave it to you to conclude what you will about this conflating of this figure or this individual in the poem, this individual who refused to betray his brethren, and Jesus Christ, and what that connection might ultimately suggest for someone like Watkins Harper. But again, I think this sense of defiance is important, and I wanted to reference a couple of different moments that are worth your consideration if you wanted to write about this poem. Notice this is stanza 2, 4, 5. This is not the first time that Watkins Harper refers to this individual as a hero. Oh, could you have seen the hero then, as his lofty soul arose, and his dauntless eyes defiance flashed on his mean and craven foes. I'll remind you again of what Frederick Douglass wrote last week about the importance of defiance, and how for him part of this process of radicalization was understanding, even if it meant his death, even if it meant suffering, awful physical pain and torment, defiance matters because, well, any act of defiance in the face of oppression sends a message. It signifies something about you and the group or collection of individuals that you might represent or symbolize. But I think more than anything, and Douglass is quite poignant about this point, it reveals the degree to which this process of breaking doesn't always work, and how even in the face of physical trauma and torment, even in the face of death, there is still room for us to assert our agency and to assert the innate power that all of us have. And I think this might remind you again of some of the transcendentalists, although the circumstances are fundamentally different, of course, but I think this might remind you of some of the transcendentalist writers that I asked you to read a couple of weeks ago, Emerson and Thoreau, the importance of asserting yourself in the face of a large majority of individuals, or even if you're just interacting with the symbolic representation of the majority, your ability to assert yourself is important. And we're seeing here the importance of defiance and the importance of asserting oneself. So defiance as a theme, it's clearly important to Watkins Harper, as it has been for several of the writers and several of the poets that we've studied this semester. But, and I mentioned this earlier, this sense that betraying your people or betraying your race is one of the worst things you can do. And I think if you just think about this a bit, the reasons why become quite clear. None of us, for example, enjoy feeling betrayed or feeling as though we can't trust someone else. But I think in this particular situation, the reason why this drive to not betray your people is so important is because for many slaves, for many African Americans, people of color, there is this feeling or this sense that the world either passively or actively is working against them. And I think we can actually see that here in this poem, this sense. And I think slavery, again, in the United States is a perfect example of this, even though there are many more we could cite, where there's a white majority working and conspiring against and creating a system that actively subjugates and works against people of color. So this sense of unity is so important, but also just this sense that there is, again, this shared trauma, and by betraying the very people who you share that trauma with, you're only deepening that sense of trauma, because now there's this additional layer. There are those within your own cohort who cannot be trusted. So it just creates this overarching sense of paranoia. And I think in moments like this, Watkins Harper demonstrates why unity matters so much. So I think I'll finish today's lecture with learning to read, which of all the poems I asked you to read, I think this one is perhaps my favorite, because the speaker here, this is clearly not Watkins Harper. She's doing something interesting that poets like to do, where she's constructing this persona that in many ways feels like a character from a novel or a short story. This is not her speaking from her own experiences, but you could imagine she's channeling someone, or perhaps a collection or even an archetype of sorts. So again, I'll read directly from the poem and then I'll offer a bit of commentary. Very soon, the Yankee teachers came down and set up school, but oh, how the Rebs did hate it. It was again their rule. Our masters always tried to hide book learning from our eyes. Knowledge didn't agree with slavery, 'twould make us all too wise. But some of us would try to steal a little from the book and put the words together and learn by hook or crook. I remember Uncle Coldwell, who took pot liquor fat and greased the pages of his book and hid it in his hat. And had his master ever seen the leaves upon his head, he'd have thought them greasy papers, but nothing to be read. And there was Mr. Turner's Ben, who heard the children spell and picked the words right up by heart and learned to read 'em well. Well, the northern folk kept sending the Yankee teachers down, and they stood right up and helped us, though Rebs did sneer and frown. And I longed to read my Bible, for precious words it said, but when I begun to learn it, folks just shook their heads and said there is no use trying. Oh, Chloe, you're too late. But as I was rising 60, I had no time to wait. So I got a pair of glasses and straight to work I went. I never stopped till I could read the hymns and testaments. Then I got a little cabin, a place to call my own, and I felt as independent as the queen upon her throne. So one of the first things I'll bring to your attention is how playful this poem sounds at times. This is something new in the other poems that I asked you to read. There is, understandably so, a seriousness. There's a somberness to the tone of many of those poems, but here, Watkins Harper at times is quite playful, which it's always nice to see some difference because, and I've talked about this all semester, there are ways that anthologies like this edit, because I can't ask you to read all of her work. That would take, if not an entire semester, but multiple semesters. So it is impossible for you to expect, or for me to expect, or the editors of this collection to expect you to read her entire corpus. So the way they edit around that corpus can have certain effects or consequences. And one of those is that at times we might have an oversimplified and perhaps incorrect understanding of an author. And I would say, I would even go as far as to say, these anthologies are edited quite well, so I don't think it's incorrect, but definitely oversimplified at times. So having this poem shows us that, while yes, she had the potential to be quite serious and quite somber, she also had the potential to sound a bit playful. And I don't know if silly is the right word, but definitely playful is a word I would use. But I think this is a poem, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that seamlessly blends this drive toward equal rights and this drive toward abolition and racial equality. And I think we see that quite visibly in these two examples, and then this subtle pivot she makes, which at that point the poem almost sounds serious in ways that it hadn't to that point, or doesn't to that point. The first example is this Uncle Caldwell, who, at least as I read it, seems to be, it sounds like the speaker celebrates him for his cleverness and his ingenuity. He finds a way to become literate while also tricking his master. He's learning to read, it seems, in plain sight, which is just fascinating. I've talked about this a bit before, that what these sorts of moments reveal is perhaps what these slave owners are ultimately lacking, how perhaps unintelligent they are at times. And then the second example is Mr. Turner's Ben, who he's learning, but he's learning through osmosis. So we're getting this sense, and again, as readers, it certainly sounds like, and I think this is the correct reading, it certainly sounds like the speaker celebrates him for his dedication, his cleverness, his ingenuity. But then there's this pivot. Well, the northern folks kept sending the Yankee teachers down, and they stood right up and helped us, though Rebs did sneer and frown. And I longed to read my Bible for precious words it said, but when I begun to learn it, folks just shook their heads. And it's worth asking, well, what does she mean by that? Is it because she's a woman, and perhaps what this is revealing, or what this is suggesting, is the overt sexism of this time? I think that's a possible reading. But I suppose the point is that there are these two other examples of black men who engaged in clever but covert activities to become literate. And when she attempted to do something similar, she was derided for it. But notice the final two stanzas, because I think this is where we have a clearer sense of the point that Watkins Harper wants to make, and it's this clear trajectory. So literacy and knowing how to read and write, even though what she wants and her expectations are quite modest, she just wants to have the ability to read the Bible. Look at what it produces. And this is similar to a figure like Frederick Douglass. Education is a path. It is something that's part of this larger trajectory. It's connecting racial equality and perhaps even independence with education. And I'll read that final stanza again. Then I got a little cabin, a place to call my own, and I felt as independent as the queen upon her throne. So here, Watkins Harper, she is actively and overtly connecting education and literacy to independence. And I think this, again, might take us back to some of those transcendentalist figures as well, and just to think about how they understood what it meant to be free, to be liberated. It's by adhering to your individual truth, what you think is right, even if it means you're antagonizing a majority in the ways that this speaker clearly antagonizes this majority. Again, but when I begun to learn it, folks just shook their heads. So this desire and this choice to learn to read, there's certainly a way of imagining that for Watkins Harper, this is a radical act for this speaker, in the same way that for Thoreau, for Emerson, embracing individuality is as radical an act as one can imagine. So I think that's all I'll say about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. I hope you enjoyed her poetry, and if you're interested in writing about Frederick Douglass, for example, and you wanted to pair him with someone, I would certainly encourage you to consider Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She is a wonderful pairing with a writer like Frederick Douglass. Okay,